Good afternoon, friends. I am Abhijit Sarkar from IIT Madras in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and we are going to have about 6 hours in spread over 3 days, that is talk on gears. In particular, we will be talking about spur gears. So, I welcome you to this talk. Let us have a quick snippet view of what is in store for us. Today, we are going to introduce the topic to you about what is spur gears and why do we need gears in the first place. After that, we are going to dissect the gears and we are going to talk about some geometric parameters associated with the gear geometry. We will define some critical terms and terminologies arising in the context of gears. And as I said, we will mostly limit ourselves to spur gears, but we will just touch upon the different other kinds of gears that are there in applications, but we will limit ourselves to spur gears. So, we will take a deep dive towards the nomenclature of spur gear systems. We will leave aside the other gears in its major part. So, in the next class probably we are going to talk about this important topic of involute gearing, as we will understand that the gear tooth profile that we have to a layman, it may look like the gear tooths are straight, but as we will understand it is not so, and if you really take a very sharp look at the gear, you will find that the gear tooths are not straight, rather it has a very special geometrical feature, and these are what is called involute tooth profiles. Most of the gears that you will see in applications are involutes. Now, there is a very specific reason why we have involutes, and all that will be explained to you through this lecture. And finally, hopefully in the last session we are going to spend some time on gear trains, which are nothing but collection of gears, as again in different application it is not one gear which does the job, it is a series of gears arranged in some specific fashion, in which case we call it a gear train. So, a collection of gears will be called as gear train, and we will be talking in details as to how to analyze a gear train. So, that is the agenda. I hope by the time we finish this lecture, we will be able to ascertain the following outcomes. So, if you are able to learn the topic, these are the visible outcomes which you should be able to measure yourself against. Hopefully by today you will be able to appreciate the importance of gear and transmission systems in machines. Why do we need gear? As I said in the first place, why can't we just use the engine itself without a gearing? That is a very important question, and hopefully I should be able to motivate you that no matter how efficient the engine is, no matter how good the engine is, there is always a chance for a good gearing system to improve the efficiency of your vehicle or your machine on the whole. So, that is what I am going to talk about in the first part of the talk today. We will also talk about right in today different types of gears used in applications. Again, these will just be sort of definitions, and we will have some pictures so that we understand that these are the different gear types which arises in application, so that in your professional field you have absolutely no difficulty in identifying the different gear types that are arising in industrial applications. But as I said, the course will mostly dwell on spur gears rather than any other form of gears. One reason is that spur gears are actually most abundantly used type of gears in application. The other reason is that if you understand spur gears, it is the simpler of the other gears. So, then you can probably proceed to have a better understanding of the other different kinds of gears, as we will see. Okay. As I said, we are going to spend some time on the geometry of the gear tooth. So, geometry of the gear tooth is not a very simple idea. The way that gear tooth is drawn is actually pretty sophisticated. It is not a simplistic curve, it is what is called an involute. We will try to emphasize why is it that the gear tooths have got to be necessarily involute, why not a simplistic idea like a straight tooth, why does it not work. So, that is something that you should be able to know by the end of at least the second day's talk. And after that we are going to spend most time in the analysis of the input output characteristics of gears and gear trains, right. So, one side of the gear train will be towards the input, which is the engine, and the other side of the gear train will be connected to the load. So, the question is, how does the, let us say, the RPM or the torque or the power change between the input and the output side of a gear train is a very important question, again arising in applications. So, we will try and answer that question for you in this course. Okay, so now to start with the topic in itself, as mechanical engineers or probably as aerospace engineers or for that matter any industrial applications, we are always interested in machines. Now let us try to get at the heart of the subject by saying that what is it that the machine does for us. I have taken two examples here. On the picture on the left shows a mobile crane for you. Now it is obvious that a mobile crane does the job of something like this. So a mobile crane is supposed to lift a load, as simple as that. So there could be a drum and pulley arrangement, and a mobile crane is supposed to lift a load W. Now how does it do that? To actually lift the load, what you need is you need to apply a torque such that the pulley gets rotated, and once the pulley gets rotated, you can understand the rope will get wound around this pulley, and as a result the weight will be lifted. So definitely in this mobile crane, the point of interest is the following, that the W or the weight, or maybe I should call it the payload, to be lifted should be as large as possible, or maybe in one word, should be maximum, right. So obviously the design has to take care that, you know, let us say the rope does not break, the pulley does not break. So those stress strain calculations you would have done in your mechanics of solid course, but we are not interested in those stress strain calculations, at least for the present. But we understand that we want to design the machine such that we want the maximal load to be lifted. We also want that the load should be lifted as fast as possible, right, because you do not want a slow performing crane. Both criteria are very important. If the crane is able to lift a large load, but the load is actually getting lifted very slowly, then obviously you can understand that, you know, all your job is going to be compromised, and you are going to have a very slow working machine. That is not what is desirable. But please note that for the crane to work, you need power. Obviously we need power. If there is no power that is given to the crane, then the crane will not work. Now what exactly is power? In this case, the power is exactly equals to the torque times rotational speed of the shaft. So this is the torque that the motor or the engine delivers, and the output of the engine or the motor is running at a speed of omega, and let us say you have directly connected the output of the motor or the engine to this pulley. In that case, the power that is being used in this mechanism is directly torque times rotational speed expressed in radians per second, that is not in RPM. So in that case you will have this as the requirement of power. So the point is, the power consumed by the machine should also be minimal. This is also a very important criteria. So we want the power consumed by the machine should be minimum. Okay. So these two are very important criterias, and none of these we want to negotiate. We want all of them at the same point. It is not that we are ready to sacrifice one of these goals in favor of the other. Each one of these goals are very important as far as this application is concerned. Similarly, I will now turn to the other example that of a metal cutting operation going on in lathe. Again, for the lathe to work, it requires power which it gets from the electric supply. That electric supply basically feeds the current to a motor, and the motor is what is rotating this spindle, right. So again, so as to say, power is a requirement, but for having a good lathe, what we want is that we want to have maximum metal removal, and we also want to have maximum metal removal in minimum time, which is the rate of metal removal should be very high, and we want to do that at minimal cost, right. Again, the machine requires power. We want to make sure that we consume minimal power, or we want to make sure that the machine is most efficient, yet is delivering its maximal metal removal rate. Now obviously you need a larger torque or you need a larger force, let us say in a shaper machine, to actually ensure that you are able to scoop out the chips which are thicker. To ensure that you actually remove metal by a larger amount, you need to take out thicker chips. That requires the application of larger force, right. Similarly, the drive, the spindle, the angular velocity of the spindle determines the speed of operation of this metal cutting tool. So in this case also you have two different parameters, that is how in order to get a maximal metal removal rate, you wish to have the speed of the drive spindle to be maximum. Similarly, you want to cut chips of maximal thickness such that most of the metal comes out very quickly, but yet you want to be efficient, you do not want to consume too much power from your electric supply, because that will add on to the bill. So therefore, the bottom line is that for every machines to work, we require power. That is again non-negotiable. That is something which first law of thermodynamics tells us. Without any power input, no machine can work. But the point is, we want power input, but we want to use our power as efficiently as possible, because power in other words means cost. If you draw more power from your electric supply line, it incurs a cost. If you draw more power from, let us say, your IC engine, and you spend more fuel in burning out the IC engine, then obviously it incurs a cost. So we require power, we require maximum load lifting capability, we require maximal velocity at which the load has to be, the work has to be accomplished, but we also want minimal cost, and that is where gear can help us. So the power requirement in itself is ascertained through either an electric supply, or from the electric supply what basically happens is that you run a motor. So motor, in that case electric motor, becomes the prime mover, which essentially converts this electrical energy to mechanical energy, and you have some power in the usable mechanical energy in the form of a rotating shaft. The same is true if you think about an IC engine. In the IC engine or the internal combustion engine, when the fuel actually burns, because of the mechanism that is present within the IC engine, the burning of the fuel, the thermal energy that is stored within the fuel is actually converted into mechanical energy, and that leads to a usable mechanical energy form, which is the rotating shaft or the crankshaft of your IC engine. Now when this crankshaft is is connected directly to the pulley of, let us say, your crane, then the pulley has to rotate, and if the pulley rotates, then as we have seen, then the payload will be lifted. So that is in essence the principle of operation of the machine. You need a prime mover or a power source, and you need a mechanism which will need to drive it. But as we will see that there is also a place for gears or transmission which actually enables the prime mover or the engine or the motor to work at its very optimal condition or its most efficient condition. So that is the job of the gears, as I will talk you through. So here is what I meant by prime movers. The prime movers are usually internal combustion engines which give usable mechanical power. By usable mechanical power, I mean the output of a prime mover such as this internal combustion engine is going to be a shaft which rotates and which delivers a torque to the output end of the rotating shaft, right. So, that is given, let us say, by internal combustion engine, at least for the automotive example. But this is not the only form of prime mover. You could have steam turbine, you could have gas turbine, you could have electric motors. All these are basically in some form or the other giving its output in the form of a shaft which is rotating, and on this shaft if you connect a load, if you connect a pulley and from the pulley you try to lift a load, then the load should be lifted, at least some part of the load should be lifted. You cannot lift obviously infinite load with a small engine. What is the limit to which the load is lifted is a different question, but we understand that the output of a prime mover in any of its form, whether steam turbine, gas turbine, electric motor, internal combustion engine, anything, is bound to give us a rotating shaft with torque and with a certain amount of torque and a certain amount of angular speed. Now, let us look very carefully as to what happens in an automobile. So, in this picture, as we are seeing, this is probably an SUV car and it is negotiating a very steep slope. Now, when the car is negotiating a steep slope, it is actually working, the engine has to actually work against a component of the weight of the car. So, therefore, the load that it has to work against such that the car is able to negotiate this steep slope is much higher than it would have taken in the straight road. So, therefore, what we realize is that for uphill terrain there is more resistive load. To ensure that the vehicle is moving, you have to supply more torque from the engine such that it is able to counteract the component of gravity which is preventing the vehicle to climb up the slope. So, the engine has to provide more torque, otherwise the vehicle will simply slide down. This is not true for the downhill terrain. When the same vehicle is going the other way around, it is climbing downhill, then the resistive load is minimal. It could almost shut down the engine and simply climb down, utilizing the gravity to its benefit. But the point here is that since the vehicle has to be drivable in diverse road condition, it has to go uphill, it has to go downhill, it has to go in a plain road. What we understand is that the vehicle manufacturer has to take care that the engine which he supplies has to finally deliver or the powertrain which he supplies has to finally deliver a diverse amount of torque. The torque requirements on the drivetrain is not fixed. Had it been a vehicle which is supposed to move only on flat roads and nothing else, then the engine manufacturer or the vehicle manufacturer would have said, I will design my engine such that the load torque is just about the same as the torque supplied by the engine. The load torque is constant because it has to drive at a constant road conditions. But since the vehicle application does not suit this assumption, the vehicle application demands that the vehicle do encounter large amounts of variations in road conditions depending upon not only the slope, upon whether this is a sandy road or whether it is a concrete road or whether it is a nicely polished road, the load conditions will differ drastically. So, the vehicle manufacturer has to ensure that his vehicle is actually able to move in all these different terrain conditions for which the load requirement is definitely diverse. It is not going to be same. The load requirement in moving these different terrain conditions are diverse. We have to appreciate that, and we have to have an engineering solution for this problem, that how are we able to achieve different load conditions arising from the same powerhouse or the powertrain of the vehicle. And again, on the other side, depending upon the driving habits of the individual, some young and hot blooded person may like to drive the car very fast, whereas a peace loving and pretty middle aged person like myself who likes to play safe would never drive beyond 30 kmph. Okay. So, this person looks like has a very different driving habit than the other person, but then the vehicle manufacturer has to make his vehicle such that both of his customers are satisfied. He cannot say that this vehicle is only meant for a rash driving person, it is not meant for the other person. Probably in case of sports vehicle, it is true that the vehicle manufacturer may think that I am making my vehicle only for high speed driving, but general vehicles which are used for the common public in our roads, they are supposed to cater for this diverse audience, which not only depends different amount of torque requirement coming from the engine, but also different amount of speed. So the speed demands also are diverse. Just like we said in the previous slide, the torque demands out of the engine is diverse. Similarly, because of the driving habits, because of the road conditions also, sometimes if the vehicle is predominantly used in highways, you expect that the vehicle will be driven at larger speeds, whereas if the vehicle is predominantly used in street conditions, in city traffic, then you expect that the vehicle will be predominantly driven at low speeds. So again, you as a vehicle manufacturer, one would like to think that the vehicle will be sold for a wide market. So depending on both driving habits and road condition, a range of vehicle speed is what is required for the vehicle. You cannot assume as a vehicle manufacturer that the vehicle will be run at one speed at one torque condition. You have to allow for the diversity of the torque and speed. So what is the problem in allowing a diverse torque and speed conditions on your engine? Well, this is the problem. So this is a graph which is basically an engine performance graph, which is taken from a very respected book on internal combustion engines. So what you see on your x-axis is the engine RPM, the output speed in RPM of your crankshaft basically. What you see on your y-axis is the brake mean effective pressure, which in a way relates to the torque that is output from the engine. So these contours, these constant level contours indicate specific fuel consumption. So obviously you want a specific fuel consumption which is lower. For the same power output, you want minimal fuel to be consumed from an engine, right. So as you see, it is only in this narrow range which is like 275 as is shown here. It is in this narrow range that the specific fuel consumption is 275 or at its minimum, so as to say. Whereas if the engine's RPM or the engine torque is supposed to go in a diverse if it is supposed to vary over a diverse range such as this part, then you can see then the specific fuel consumption could range from the value of 610 to 275. So that is if I have to cater for different load conditions and different RPM conditions as indicated by the range of this graph, then my specific fuel consumption can be as good as 275 or as bad as 610, which is like about my specific fuel consumption can be about more than double compromised. And actually it may so happen that my torque and speed conditions are even more diverse than is shown in this graph. So all that I am saying to you is that if you directly connect the output of your engine onto the load or onto the wheels, then what will happen is that depending upon the different speeds and depending upon the different torque requirements that arise while driving your vehicle, you will have a very drastic change of the specific fuel consumption of your engine. The engine will run at its suboptimal conditions if you are not operating the engine at precisely this sweet spot. This is the sweet spot of the engine wherein the specific fuel consumption is low. But you can understand that if you have to run for this low specific fuel consumption, your tolerances in terms of engine speed and engine torque is minimal. You cannot change the engine speed, you cannot change the engine torque. If you change the engine speed, you have a drastic difference in fuel consumption. If you change the engine torque, you have a drastic difference in fuel consumption. So as I said, we want different, we want our machines to run at different speeds We want our machines to lift different amounts of loads, but we also want to attain the minimal cost feature. So the minimal cost feature can therefore be attained if we make a certain appliance which ensures that the engine will always run at this optimal point, but accordingly the torque and the speed will be magnified or demagnified such that we are able to actually get the machine working in these diverse conditions. That is exactly what a transmission box in automobile does. That is exactly what a gear is supposed to do, and that is why we are studying gears. So as I said, for economic viability, the engine should be running in a narrow range of torque and speed, but the user demands for torque and speed vary over a wide range. So therefore we have a problem, and the engineering solution of this is as simple as putting a gear. So let us see what basically a gear does. So here is two gears which are in engagement. One of them has diameter d, the other of them has diameter n times d, and from the diagram it is pretty clear that n is greater than 1. So what is going to happen, and we will prove that in details as we talk, is that one of these gears will be connected towards the engine or the input side, the other gear will be connected towards the load side, which is in the case of automobile the wheel side. Now the demands for the load, as I said, will fluctuate. Whereas we want to keep the engine running at its optimal point. What is the optimal point? The optimal point is that dictated by the fuel consumption. So the fuel consumption says that the optimal torque as seen by the engine should be rather this, which is translating to a brick mean effective pressure of about 500 kilopascals, whereas the optimal speed is about 2500 rpm. So we want to ensure that the engine speed is always at that point, so that the engine is running at its most efficient performance. Whereas we want different torques. So how will we do it? So if we put a gear as shown here, it turns out that on the output side the speed will be omega divided by n, and on the load side it will be torque multiplied by n. So if we want more torque, then what can give us a solution is that if n is, let us say 2, then the torque that will be obtained on the load side is twice that is delivered by the engine. So you can at least think of increasing the torque, but then you have to compromise on decreasing the velocity. So the output load and torque will be somewhere here with an increased torque but reduced velocity. Unfortunately, you cannot get both. You cannot have increased torque as well as increased velocity. You have to compromise on at least one factor. But please note that compromise was not possible. You could not go either in the x direction or in the y direction simply by using engine and engine alone without the transmission. But now the transmission allows you, the gearing system allows you to increase or decrease the torque at will, and accordingly decrease or increase the speed without compromising the engine performance. The engine performance or the engine fuel efficiency is stay put at its optimal point, whereas you can extract any amount of load that you want. Again, to give a different examples from application, let us look back at the crane application. So if we are really interested to pick up a larger load, a heavier load, then we should not mind really to lift that heavier load probably slowly. That makes sense. So we will have a torque requirement which is high, in which case we will put this gear, the second gear, with diameter n times d, and we will choose n to be greater than 1, 2 or 3 or something like that, such that we are able to have a greater load torque in our machine. For that, it is understood that the speed will come down. So we will have to compromise on that. We cannot demand that we will increase both the payload capacity as well as the speed of working of this machine. Both, if it increases, then it will defy first law, that is the output power will not stay same as the input power. Please understand there is no power that is getting generated in gears. The power is getting generated in the engine. So the engine basically supplies the torque and the speed fundamentally, but it is the gear which sorts of trades off between this torque and omega, keeping the power same. So, keeping the P equals to T omega same, I can get different values of different combinations, so as to say, of the load torque and the speed, such that my requirement of both torque and speed is met during the inverse condition. I should be careful in saying that, because if my demand is I want more torque as well as more speed, that cannot be met from first law of thermodynamics. So, no point in lamenting over that. But if I have to really negotiate a very steep slope, as in this case, I would do that in first gear, and in first gear what happens is that my torque actually goes higher, but my speed goes down, as you would have realized while possibly riding a vehicle. So, in case my torque requirements are actually diverse, then what do I have to do? I have to have many such gears. If sometimes while negotiating on a, let us say, a slope of 10 degree, I require a gear which is just 2 times that of the driver gear over here. But for a slope of 30 degree, I will require another gear now, which let us say is 4 times, 5 times this driver gear, such that I am able to get a higher torque. Obviously, in that case I will come down even lower in speed, and at some point this will not work, because if I lower my speed and become very infinitesimally moving, then that defeats the purpose, but that is quite far away. That is quite far away from reality. So, in principle you should be able to get a wide range of torque and wide range of speed arising from the engine itself, and that is what the gear does for us. So, I hope that sorts of makes it clear. As I said, power produced by the engine is the power consumed by the load. In effect, most mechanical transmission will have a very good efficiency. It is nearly about 90% or even more than 90%. So, the losses, so as to say, within the transmission are minimal, though there are losses, but in well lubricated gears all these losses can be accounted for very nicely. So, we are not in the analysis that we are going to talk about, we are mostly going to be saying that these are lossless gears, and especially in comparison to the efficiency of the engine, the gear efficiency is very good. Engine efficiency is drastically lower than the gear efficiency. So, power produced by the engine will be, for our purposes, power consumed by the load. Actually there is a loss, so power produced by the engine is, in realistically speaking, will be slightly greater than the power consumed by the load, but we are going to at least assume for our purposes that it is an equality. So, as I said, that what the gear does for us is that it is able to trade off between the torque and the speed, and this manipulation is what the gear is attaining for us. Okay, gears are just present everywhere, they are ubiquitous, and if you look at the vehicle, every vehicle will have a gear. Even if you think it is an automatic transmission, the automatic transmission does have gear, it is just that you do not have to have a lever by which you are changing those gears. Internally there are gears which are doing its job, and so much so that our Make in India emblem is entirely made of gears. So, it is lovely to see that it is the gears which are driving all machines, and that is very symbolically brought out through this emblem. Okay, with that introduction, let us start getting into the heart of the subject, which is we will start from this idea of a friction disc. So, what is a friction disc? Friction disc are 2 discs which are rotating in the fashion as is shown in this drawing over here, but as the name suggests, the friction between these 2 discs is pretty high, which actually ensures that the point at which it touches, these 2 gears, these 2 discs, I am sorry, are touching somewhere here at the point of tangency. If the friction is adequate, then you can expect that there is no slipping at the point of contact. That means the point of contact seen on the blue disc is moving at the same velocity as the point of contact moving in the red disc. So, that means the translational velocity of this point of contact, whether you see it from the blue disc or whether you see it from the red disc, has got to be the same, because if the velocities are different, that would mean that there is slipping. But since we said that the friction is adequate, slipping should be prevented. So therefore this does not happen, and therefore omega 1 R1 should be equals to omega 2 R2. So this is how the friction disk works, that is, we are having two discs of radius R1 and R2, and to prevent slipping at the point of contact, by its very definition friction disk should not have any slip at the point of contact, and that essentially means that the velocity at the point of contact should be same from both the discs. So that essentially means omega 1 R1 should be equals to omega 2 R2. Now if we draw the free body diagram of these discs, so between these two discs, I will draw one in red. This is the red disc, and I will draw the other in blue. And I will now come back to black color to indicate the forces. So obviously there has to be a contact force between the two discs, otherwise if there is no contact force, then virtually there is no contact between the two discs. So there is a normal force which is acting between the two discs, and as we said, this one moves in this fashion, and therefore the blue disc will move in the opposite direction. From the kinematics it is pretty clear. So now what we understand, if we say that this is the driver gear, then to prevent this guy from moving, there will be a friction force mu times n, and there will be a friction force here which is also mu times n. Please note that all these forces, both the normal reaction and the frictional force itself acting between these two discs, are nothing but action reaction pair. That means one of the forces is given to the other disc as an action, and it gets back an equal and opposite reaction. But please note now, because of this mu n which is same for both the disc, the torque in disc 1 is going to be mu n times R1, whereas the torque in the second disc is going to be mu times n times R2. Okay. So the torque, as you see, is dependent upon the frictional force, the coefficient of friction, the normal reaction, as well as the radius of the disc. Now as we said that we want to have usually in applications, again it so happens, as at least in automotive applications, you generally require higher torques. The engine operates at fairly high speed, but at such high speeds the torque that the engine produces is not suited to application. The load torque which your vehicle demands is actually much more than what the engine supplies. So usually it will be that you will like to go for a gear such that the torque requirements from the load side can be met. So that in turn means that the torque is directly proportional to this normal force, as we see. So normal force is n, and the tangential force due to friction is mu n, as we just showed you. So therefore the torque on both these discs are calculated as mu n R1 and mu n R2, as we just showed. So therefore the bottom line is that to transmit a large torque you need a large n. Obviously having a large R and R1 and large R2 could also be a solution, but then if you have a large R1 and large R2, that essentially means you are having a very bulky arrangement which takes up a lot of space, and to get these large masses moving you also require a lot of effort, and a lot of power will be actually wasted in making this, in setting up the motion for this large mass, because this is large inertia. To make it move from static to a dynamic condition you will require a large amount of power. So that will be a loss. So you would not like to unnecessarily increase the size of your transmission. So therefore the only other way in which you can increase the torque requirements is by ensuring that the normal force is high. But then that is also a very dangerous solution, because if the normal force on these discs is high, then that normal force will in turn get transmitted to the shaft on which this disc is mounted, and which means that the shaft will now be subjected to an extremely high transverse loading, and as you have studied in your course on solid mechanics, it is going to bend like a beam, and if it bends like a beam, then actually the contact, if the shaft is going to bend like a beam, the contact between the two gears will be thrown off, and actually the contact between two friction discs will be lost, and when that happens, then the friction disc itself will not work. So therefore that is not a solution. So therefore as I conclude that there will be, if you have a large normal force, then that in turn would imply that it will have a large bending stress in the shaft. Let me just once again illustrate what I mean here. So as you understand, each of these discs would have to be actually mounted through some bearing onto a shaft. The disc has to be mounted onto a shaft. The shaft in turn has to be mounted on a bearing. But if we now look at the shaft which is carrying this gear, this disc, so this shaft is going to get back this force N, right. So this time I am drawing the free body diagram of only the shaft without the disc. So this shaft is like placed on two bearings, which I am indicating schematically in this fashion. So this is exactly the situation what we studied in solid mechanics when we did deflection of beams. So now we get to see that you have a shaft on which there is an extremely high normal force. So you can now understand that this beam, this shaft rather, will deflect. If it deflects, the disc which is mounted on this shaft will also sort of move downwards, and if it is moving downwards, it will lose engagement with the red disc. So your contact will be lost, and therefore the transmission will not happen. So that is a dangerous situation. So we won't want that. So therefore friction disc, though conceptually very nice and sort of works, the idea works, but we see that realistically speaking this idea is very difficult to incorporate in applications. Okay, so the answer therefore is not in friction disc, the answer is there in gears, and the reason why we brought up this topic of friction disc is just to ensure that we understand why gears have to be used. So friction we understand happens because of interlocking arrangements of teeth which are in a micro scale. In a micro scale we know that friction is between the interlocking arrangements of asperities and teeth which are there on the two surfaces. But then these asperities and teeth are actually not designed by humans, it is coming in naturally mostly, and we have no control over those asperities. So what people thought is that why don't we design some, we as humans design some tooth which sort of mimics this friction action. So therefore the idea came that if it is not friction disc, let it be a disc or a wheel on which has got artificial tooth, and these tooths will be carefully designed by engineers such that all the conditions will be met, and that is what we will call as gears. So therefore the gears are born, which again a very simplistic yet complete definition is that the gears are nothing but toothed wheel. But the point is that this tooth geometry is not as simple as it looks, it is definitely not straight, and it is more complicated, much more complicated than that, and that is what we are going to spend time on in the subsequent slides. Okay, so the objective, we must not forget, the objective of gears is to transmit constant angular velocity ratio, or in other words that effectively means if the power has to remain same, then the torque ratio also should be maintained constant between the two rotating shafts at all times. So it is not required that the velocity of the input be the same as the velocity at the output shaft. The red shaft will be moving at a different velocity to the black shaft, but the point is that whatever is the velocity of the output shaft, that should be dead constant, it should not fluctuate. If that is assuming that the engine speed is constant, if the engine speed is constant, we must have the output shaft speed also to be constant, and we will later see that it is this requirement which is actually ruling out the presence of straight tooths in gears, which you may think is possibly a good idea from even the manufacturing perspective, but it turns out it is not a good idea, because a straight tooth will not be able to maintain its constant velocity ratio. So, the objective, I will repeat, in using a gear will be to enable a constant velocity ratio at all times. And what do I mean by velocity ratio? This is the ratio of velocities between the output shaft and the input shaft, which in other words means if our input shaft moves at constant speed, your output shaft should also move at constant speed. This in turn also means the constant torque ratio, because as we have seen that the velocity ratio and the torque ratio are just reciprocal of each other. That is going to happen as long as there is no power dissipation in gearing, which is what we will hold on to. So, with that perspective, let us go ahead and make a few more remarks. By this time you would have studied mechanisms, you would have known what are lower pair and higher pair mechanisms. Gears fall into the class of higher pair mechanisms. There is actually a line contact between the meshing spur gears. So, I think I will make myself clear later as we talk about higher pair mechanisms, but at present just take it as a fact that gears are higher pair mechanisms rather than lower pair mechanisms. You will like to have a higher value of N or normal reaction, but that is again detrimental, because that leads to shaft deflection and shaft stresses and so on and so forth. So, that is the idea, that why I am ruling out the opportunity of using friction disc to transmit large torque. There are other issues also. Friction discs, if they are used, they will actually lead to large energy wastage, because friction generates heat, and heat, once heat is created, that is an loss in terms of mechanical energy or mechanical power. So, that is also a flip side of using friction disc. So, I hope I have answered your question. In case you have further clarification, please hand raise. I will have a interaction with you. PECTN is asking about differential gears. We will, as I said, we will talk only about spur gears in this class. Differential gears are made up of bevel gears. It is actually planetary bevel gears. So, therefore, at this stage definitely I do not want to talk about it. To answer your question, gears used in differential are bevel gears, and the train is actually a planetary gear train. So, we are not going to do a differential gear analysis in these 6 hours. Okay, so I think these are the two questions that were there in my box. If there are any other questions, or if there are anyone else who wishes to have any interaction, I will be happy to take their questions at this stage. So, now let us talk about the different gear types. The class that we will be interested is the class of gears which transmits motion between two parallel shafts. Parallel shafts, as you know, are most commonly used in applications. So, this is the type of gears that you will see in the gearbox of your lathe machine, you will see it in the gearbox of your car. So, these gears are pretty much used in widespread in applications. So, there are two further divisions within this class, that is those gears which transmit motion between parallel shafts, right. They can either be straight tooth or they can be helical, which is the topic which we are not going to touch upon much, but at least we should understand the differentiation between straight tooth gear and or a spur gear and a helical gear. So, what we mean by a spur gear or a straight tooth gear is the following. I have a picture of it. So, if you look at it carefully, all the sections of this spur gear are going to be the same. Maybe I will draw a picture in my tablet. So, let us say this is the thickness of, I would like to draw a better gear. Yeah. So, let us say this is the thickness of the gear, and let us take two sections, one here and the other here. Okay. Just for illustration, I am taking two sections. I will call this section as AA and this section as BB. If both the sections are identical, so for spur gears, both sections are identical. There is nothing different between the two sections. In such case, it is a spur gear. That essentially means that in the front view, when you draw the front view of this gear system, and I will not draw the full gear, I am just going to draw a disc with a few tooth. Okay, please excuse my drawing. Okay, so along the direction of the thickness, it is just the same. So it is this graph, or if I stick with the front view, the same section keeps repeating throughout the thickness. The thickness direction, there is nothing which is changing, which is why I said the spur gears have identical sections, whereas this is not true for helical gears. So in helical gears, there will be a helix angle. The tooth will not go straight in the direction of the thickness, it will go along the helix. Helix, as you know, is the curve. If I traverse over a cylindrical surface of this kind, if I take this as a cylindrical surface, as I am traversing on the cylindrical surface, the curve that is traced out is helix. Whereas if I traverse along the axis, then it is a straight line, right. So that essentially is the key distinction between a spur gear and a helical gear. So in spur gears, as you see in this picture, the tooth thickness is straight, it is parallel to the axis of the gear, it is exactly straight, whereas the helical gear picture is shown in this figure. Here you will see that the direction of the tooth thickness is not exactly aligned with the direction of the axis of the gear. The axis of the gear is still parallel with the direction of the tooth thickness, but it is coming at a helix angle. So this has major implications in terms of performance, especially the vibration and the noise characteristics in a helical gear as opposed to spur gear. But you will appreciate that the helical gear geometry is little more complicated than the spur gear geometry. So that is why it makes sense to first understand the geometry from the perspective of spur gear and then go and study helical gears. Obviously it is not that difficult, but definitely we should not attempt to understand helical gears before spur gears. We will try to do the other way around. First we will take up spur gears and then hopefully you should be able to study helical gears in your institute itself. So that is one distinction, straight tooth gears are spur gears, whereas helical tooth gears are the helical gears. Now even within straight tooth gear there is an interesting special case. If one of these gear diameters is actually very large, or in the limiting case infinite. So what we are seeing is a rack and pinion arrangement, that is, if this gear is actually not even circular, or rather it is a circular gear with a very large radius, limiting case infinity, that essentially means that instead of a circular mesh you will mesh with a rack. Okay. So this is a circular gear which meshes with a rack. So here between two spur gears we have motion transfer in the form of rotational motion. So rotational motion of one gear is transmitted as rotational motion of the other gear. So spur gears are used for transmission of rotational motion. The motion characteristics is always rotational. The angular speed may increase or decrease depending upon the gear ratio that you are using, but the point is that rotational motion remains rotational. But here between rack and pinion, the motion transmission is between translational motion and rotational motion. So that is a very crucial difference between rack and pinion arrangement and spur gear arrangement. In rack and pinion, it is, if the rack is the driver, then it is a uniform linear velocity will be converted to a uniform rotational velocity, or if it is non-uniform translational velocity, then it will be converted to a non-uniform translational velocity. But the key factor is that translation to rotation, this conversion is happening through a rack and pinion arrangement. And as I said, for bevel gears, it is the transmission between two intersecting shafts. So this is a bevel gear. The bevel gear is actually made out of a frustum of a cone, but let's not worry so much of that, because if you see the picture of it, it looks almost like a conical. But the key factor to realize is that this, if you look at these two bevel gears which are mounted in those two shafts, these shafts are actually intersecting. Whereas if you look at the helical gears, the axis of the helical gears are parallel, axis of the spur gears are parallel, whereas the axis of the bevel gears are intersecting. So this is a key difference. So if you want to transmit motion from one shaft to the other and these shafts happen to be intersecting, then these are bevel gears. So as someone asked the question, bevel gear is predominantly used in differentials, and there is a reason for that, because the way the differential transmission works, it requires a bevel gear. So similarly, you have a case of spiral gear, and spiral gear is used for transmitting motion between skewed shafts. So skewed shafts, as we understand from geometry, skew lines are those lines which are neither parallel nor intersecting. So especially in 3 dimension, you can have this situation where there are two lines which are neither parallel nor intersecting, in which case we call these lines as skewed lines in 3-dimensional geometry. In the context of machines, we call them skewed shafts if the two shafts are neither parallel nor intersecting, and then the manner in which transmission of motion can be attained between these two shafts is through spiral gearing. So again, we will not talk much about spiral gearing and bevel gearing and helical gearing. We will limit ourselves to spur gears for the remainder of this course. Okay, now that we have understood the terminologies of different gears and we have decided that we will talk mostly on spur gears, we will dissect out the spur gears for you, and we will try and understand the different components or the different terminologies that are used to define the geometry of the spur gears. As I said, the primary important learning outcome based on this course is that we must be able to have a clear idea as to what is the geometry of a spur gear, and we must also feel convinced that why such a geometry is required for operation. So towards that end, let us define the anatomy of spur gears, and to start with we have to define what is known as pitch circle. So the definition of it goes this way, that the pitch circle is an imaginary circle. It is not a circle which you can see on the gear. So please don't expect that a pitch circle will be drawn on the gear. It is just an imaginary circle, but the point is that it is an imaginary circle which rolls without slipping on the pitch circle of the mating gear, transmitting identical motion. So in other words, as we introduce this topic of gear to you, you realize that gears are supposed to be friction discs in some way. The problem associated with friction disc was that to transmit large torques you required large forces, that in turn led to stress based failure and deflections and things like that. But essentially in terms of geometry of motion, the idea was that we are going to replace the friction disc transmission process with a gear with or a toothed wheel which is in mesh, which will have an identical transmission of the velocity characteristics. So therefore, we would like to think the velocity transmission characteristics between two gears to be equivalent to those two imaginary friction discs. We are actually not going to operate friction discs here, but at the same time when we are analyzing gears, we would rather be helped in our analysis to think that what is the equivalent transmission characteristics of friction disc which this gear is able to perform for us. So towards that end, we define what is pitch circle. Again, in a very layman terminology, pitch circle is basically that friction disc which the gear has replaced. Okay. So in a more technical terminology, it comes out this way. As we understand, friction disc also rolls without slipping. It cannot slip over the other mating friction disc. So therefore, pitch circle of a gear is defined as this imaginary circle which is equivalent to the friction disc which will transmit identical motion. So it turns out that all other geometries of our gear is referenced with respect to the pitch circle. So this is the first anatomical characteristics of a gear, of a spur gear, and we will therefore move ahead with more. But before we move ahead with more, let us just elaborate that point, that the motion transmission between gears is identical to the motion transmission between two friction discs with diameters equal to the pitch circle diameter. So we are trying to strike an equivalence between the idea of friction discs and the idea of gears. It is just that the idea of friction disc cannot be implemented in practice because of the issues that I had elaborated. We are trying to replace that those nuances with the help of gears, which are straight to wheels. But at the same time, we wish to hold back onto the analysis simplicity of the analysis that is possible for friction discs. So therefore, we are saying that we are going to introduce this concept of pitch circle, which are basically those friction discs such that they will transmit identical motion as the two gears that we are interested in. So for the friction, now that we have made that equivalence, we can define this very special point which is called the pitch point. You understand that the way in manner in which this friction disc operates is that there will be a point of contact between these two friction discs wherein the friction will be such that there is no slipping. So that will actually ensure that omega 1 R1 should be equals to omega 2 R2. So the point of contact between the two friction discs, which in turn are the pitch circles, is called the pitch point. So pitch point is basically the point of tangencies of the pitch circle, and if you know what is the pitch circle, there has to be a pitch point. Please understand, there is no other way but the pitch circles have to touch each other. You cannot have two pitch circles which are not touching. If the pitch circles are not touching, that means the equivalent friction disc is not going to transmit the motion. So if the equivalent friction disc doesn't transmit motion, then it is basically useless. So the gearing arrangement is useless. So you will have the situation where the pitch circle will have to touch, and this point of touching of the pitch circles between the two mating gears is called the pitch point. Okay, so as we said, the two discs will be rolling without slipping. The point of contact will have the same velocity whether you construe that to be a point in body 1 or a point in body 2. So that is a very important description of ruling out what is called as slipping. If a body slips over the other body, then there is relative velocity at the point of contact, whereas if there is no slipping, that means the point of contact is sort of, there is no relative velocity of the point of contact as seen from one body towards the other, or in other words, the absolute velocity of this point of contact, whether you construe this point of contact to be in one body or the other, either way it should be the same. So this is exactly what we said a few moments back. So that essentially gives us, even for a friction disc, omega 1 R1 is equals to omega 2 R2. The fact that at the point of contact, which now we understand is the tangency point between the two pitch circles, and that we have defined it as pitch point. So the pitch point velocity, whether you call this pitch point a point in the disc 2 or the point in disc 1, either way it should have the same velocity. That is the constraint that we are now putting, because we understand that in friction disc it is always rolling without slipping. So we have replaced the gear for the analysis purpose, not for the real installation purpose, but for the analysis purpose we are replacing the gear with the friction disc, and the friction disc equivalence makes us very sure that at the pitch point whatever is the velocity, linear velocity that is, it should be same. So that gives us the very important condition that omega 1 R1 is equals to omega 2 R2, where omega 1 and omega 2 are the two angular velocities, R1 and R2 are the pitch circle radius or the equivalent friction disc radius, right. So R1 and R2, please remember, are the pitch circle radius. As I said that it is mostly with reference to pitch circle that most of these formulas will come out, but it is not that all formulas are also with reference to pitch circle. There will be some formulas which will be based on some other circles, as we will come to know, but this one is definitely with respect to pitch circle. R1 and R2 refers to the pitch circle of disc 1 and disc 2. Okay, the addendum circle is another circle which is almost visible in the gear. If you just happen to draw an imaginary circle around the outer periphery of the gear, then that circle is called the addendum circle. So, addendum circle of a gear is an imaginary circle which of the gear which is passing through the outer periphery. Obviously, we are dealing with circular gears here, we are not dealing with any non-circular gears. So, accordingly the addendum circle is that which is the imaginary circle passing through the outer periphery. And addendum in itself is the difference between the addendum circle radius and the pitch circle. So, this circle, as I am scrolling my mouse, you can understand this circle is the pitch circle. It is shown here in the label, and the outer circle is the addendum circle, and the difference between these two is the addendum. So, addendum is the addendum circle radius minus pitch circle radius. Similarly, dedendum is the imaginary circle which is passing through the bottom of the gear tooth, that is the inner periphery of the gear. So, this circle is the dedendum circle which is just passing through the base of the gear tooth. And similarly, dedendum is the difference between the pitch circle radius and the dedendum circle. So, dedendum circle radius is denoted as RD and dedendum is denoted as RP minus RD. Okay, face width. Face width is the thickness along the direction of the thickness, the total distance is the face width. So, the thickness of the gear along the axis of the gear. Obviously, here we understand we are dealing with spur gear. So, this is one distinguishing characteristics of spur gear, that the thickness is along the axis of the gear, and that is called, and that thickness is given the name as face width. So, you can understand that the mesh or the contact between the two gear tooths will be happening on this orange colored surface. It is not going to happen on the grey surface. This is the view of the gear as seen from the front. There is no contact that is going to happen in the front. It will happen over this orange surface. So, therefore, face width is the thickness of that surface over which the contact is happening. Now, we come to face and flank. So, this surface over which the contact is happening, this orange surface over which the contact is happening is called face and flank. The portion of this surface which is above the pitch circle. You understand that the pitch circle is, so let us again draw this a little carefully in the tablet. So, again if I have to draw the front view of it, of a tooth, this is how it looks. And if I have to see from the side view, this is how it looks, right. So, this is this distance is the face width, now on the tooth the pitch circle will be passing. So, this is the pitch circle. Now, accordingly in the side view, this is the pitch circle, right, and therefore, there is a portion which is face which is above the pitch circle, and there is a portion flank which is below the pitch circle. So, this is face and this is flank, and this is face and this is flank. Okay. So, I hope you got this clear. Right. So, the portion which is beyond the pitch circle, which is above the pitch circle as per this drawing, is face. The portion which is below the pitch circle is flank. Similarly, top land and bottom land, the portion which is above the area at the top edge of the tooth, this almost white colored surface which you can see is called the top land. So, at the top of the gear, the flat land which is available, that is what is called the top land. So, the area at the top edge of the tooth along the direction of the thickness is the top land. So, this is the top land, and similarly the bottom land is the area at the bottom edge of the tooth along the direction of the tooth thickness. So, that is called the bottom land. So, there is top land and there is bottom land. So, these are different anatomical features as I am told you. Okay, now that we are seeing that in almost all of these drawings, and if as you have minutely observed the gear tooth profile, the gear tooth looks something like this. We don't quite know what is the exact geometry of it, but definitely it is not straight. Accordingly, you can understand that the thickness here and the thickness at the dedendum. So, thickness at the addendum and thickness at the dedendum is definitely not same. So, this I will call TD and this I will call as TA. Okay. So, therefore, we need to when we refer to the tooth thickness, we will have to be very careful, because the thickness of the tooth, that is the thickness in the front view, not in the side view. So, thickness of the tooth keeps changing as you are moving along the profile of the gear tooth. So, by definition or by standardization rather, gear tooth thickness is the one which is measured along the pitch circle. So, this, when we report that the thickness of the gear tooth is such and such value, then we refer to the tooth thickness on the pitch circle, which in the drawing would mean this. So, this thickness which is on the pitch circle, because this is the pitch circle which we already know how to decipher. So, this on this pitch circle, the end to end distance is the circular thickness or pitch thickness. Okay. So, this is what we will refer to. We will usually not use the addendum circle and the dedendum circle for referring to the thickness of the gear tooth. Okay. So, this is the tooth thickness which is measured along the gear. Now, between two teeth, you can see that there is a gap, and that gap is called the space width. So, let me just demonstrate once more in my drawing what that means. So, let us say that there is one gear tooth here and following gear tooth here. Okay, and this is the pitch circle. So, we understand that this is the circular thickness or the tooth thickness, and this is the space width. So, the gap in between the two consecutive tooth as measured on the pitch circle. You can realize the gap is more on the addendum, the gap is less on the dedendum, but the gap as measured on the pitch circle is what we call as space width. The other reason why we call this as space width is the following. This is actually the space where the meshing tooth will sit in order to complete the engagement. So, when the meshing happens, you will realize if this is one gear, and I will draw the other gear in a different color. So, the other gear tooth will come and sit over here. So, that means there has to be the space that is given to the other gear tooth from the meshing gear to occupy this space such that the engagement takes place. If the space is not available, there will be interference and the meshing will not happen. So, therefore, deliberately you have to leave that space such that the engagement can actually take place, otherwise the gearing action will not happen. So, that is why we have to have this space width, and it so happens that you have to allow, see the space width should be such that the tooth thickness of this meshing gear. So, this is somewhat like the tooth thickness of this meshing gear. Now, the space width that is left must be more than the tooth thickness of the meshing gear. So, therefore, if as we will see that everything is referenced with respect to module, and that in turn decides that the space width has got to be more than the tooth thickness. Okay. So, if the space width and the tooth thickness are actually same, then there is a chance of interference. The gear tooth will not have adequate space to nicely fit into the space and have the engagement done correctly. So, therefore, that is not a solution. You have to give space width which is more than the tooth thickness such that the meshing gear tooth is easily able to sit in that space and is able to have nice and smooth engagement. But that causes also one problem. If you reverse the gear, that means let us say presently that this is the driver and this is the driven. Okay, so this is being driven, the black one is being driven in this fashion. So, but now if you the driver always is the red one, which is here. But now if I try to reverse the direction of the gear, then by the time that again engagement happens, there has to be an idle period which is exactly this. So this is called the backlash. So the reversing will not happen exactly at the time we want. The gear has to first cover a distance which is equal to backlash, because we said that the space width is more than the tooth thickness. The gear, the driver gear has to cover that additional distance, and only then the gearing will be again engaged, and then the motion reversal will happen on the driven side also. But this may not be of major concern in examples like automotive and things like that. But let us say you are having a gear to move the rudder of a military rudder. The rudder, as you know, is supposed to track the orientation of, let us say, a fighter plane which has very high maneuverability, and rapidly that target is changing its orientation, and the rudder has to follow pretty efficiently that target. Now if the gear which is actually moving that rudder is having a backlash problem, then that rudder will not be able to work, because for a small amount of motion that reversal of is not being attained by the rudder. So that will be a disastrous in such applications. So backlash is a major problem in certain applications. Backlash also has certain implications in terms of dynamics of gears, but let us not get into it. But all that I want to say is that backlash is a necessary evil. Backlash has to be there in gears, but at the same time in certain applications it can be very fatal, is backlash. Okay. So now let us get to another important terminology, which is called the circular pitch. So as we understand, all the tooth on this gear is completely identical. So if we measure the distance between 2 points which are identical but on 2 subsequent teeths, and again the distance is measured along the pitch circle, then that is called circular pitch. So circular pitch is the distance along the pitch circle between 2 identical points on the consecutive tooth. So what we have shown is that this is somewhat like the midpoint of this tooth. The other point that is picked up is also the midpoint on the subsequent tooth. The distance between these 2 midpoints, which are like identical points but on 2 different tooth, and this distance as measured on the pitch circle is called the circular pitch. So again I will just like to elaborate a little further. So again let me draw two tooth. This is one and this is the other. So this point and this point is identical. Similarly this point and this point is identical. So the distance between any of these 2 points as measured on the pitch circle is called the circular pitch. This one or this one, whichever one you want to call, any of these can be called as circular pitch. And what has been shown in the slide is the distance between the 2 midpoints. Okay. So this distance also measured on the pitch circle is circular pitch. So anyway you can measure the circular pitch. So usually you do not measure, after all these are all parts of standardizations, and we will see those standardization in a moment. Okay. So now how do we calculate this pitch circle, the circular pitch given, let us say, the pitch circle diameter. Now we know the total circumference that is covered is pi times pitch circle diameter, and if there are n number of tooths on this pitch circle, then therefore the total number, the value of the pitch circle the value of the circular pitch comes out as pi d by n. I have just used the subscript p to remind myself that this is the diameter of the pitch circle, not the diameter of the addendum circle or the dedendum circle. So pi d by n is the circular pitch, and the way to derive that is pretty simple. Pi d is the total distance of the pitch circle from end to end, because it is a circle, it is pi d, and since there are n points which are identically and equally split, since there are n tooth, since there are n tooth on this pitch circle, two identical points between the successive tooth will have a distance of pi dp, because they are all equally spaced. So therefore pitch circle value comes out as pi dp by n. Again, what we will see soon enough is that the values of tooth thickness, face width, flank, all these ideas, the fillet radius, everything is referenced with respect of either circular pitch or module. So this is again a part of standardization. Gear designers will do all these detailed calculations by which they fix up what should be the dimensions of the addendum, dedendum, tooth thickness, and so on and so forth. You just have to take out from the shelf. You have to just, when you go to the market to buy gears, you just have to specify the module. Once you specify the module and let us say the standard by which the gear is manufactured, then the standard in terms of this module will give you all the other geometric details like thickness and width and so addendum and dedendum and so on and so forth. We shall see some of those standards in the subsequent slides. Diametral pitch and module is related. Just like circular pitch was pi dp by n, module is dp by n. So pi times module is circular pitch. Okay. So dp by n, this quantity is called module. It is having the dimensions of length, because d has a dimension of length. Diametral pitch is the reciprocal of module. It is having the dimensions of 1 by length. Okay. Usually we will refer it, the standards will refer in terms of module rather than in terms of diametral pitch. But again, the gear community has been vast, and across different countries there has been different standards. Some standards are with reference to the module, some are with reference to diametral pitch or circular pitch. So that is why there are all these different terminologies which are introduced in this subject. So as per standardization, geometric dimensions of the gear is given in terms of module or diametral pitch, right. So geometric dimensions such as thickness, such as fillet radius, such as addendum, such as face width, all of these things are in terms of the module or diameter. So once you specify the module of the gears, basically everything about the geometry of the gears gets fixed. In fact, you do not even need to do those calculations, because those calculations have been done as a part of standardizations, and as I said, we will just look through some of these standardization results. So this is again a very important result, that between two meshing gears the module or pitch has to be identical, that is d1 by n1 has got to be d2 by n2. So this is again a well known result, but it is not very difficult to understand why this requirement happens, that the module of the two meshing gears have to be identical. So towards that end, let us look at the engagement process of the two gears. So here what I have shown to you on the left is the engagement process. So the reason why it appears very colorful is that I want to clearly distinguish the different tooths which are in engagement. So in the figure on your top, what you see is that at initially, that is, the red pair of tooth is in contact. What happens after a certain time is that the following pair of tooth, that is the blue pair of tooth, is now in contact. The red pair of tooth has now gone out of engagement. So at certain instant I am seeing that the red pair of teeth is in contact. After a later time, the situation is just completely identical, but it is the blue pair of tooth which is in contact. Had I drawn all these tooth geometries with the same color, you would not have even been able to distinguish that these two drawings are different. But I have therefore on purpose drawn the tooth with different color just to show you that between these two drawings there is a difference, that the next pair of teeth has now come into contact. Now therefore, what I want is that when the blue pair of teeth in this gear 2 is taking the position of the red teeth in the gear 2, in that time the blue teeth in gear 1 should come and occupy the position of gear of the red teeth in gear 1, right. So the time taken by this blue teeth to move to this red position is exactly equal to the time taken by this blue teeth to get into the red position. So both the time should be exactly same, and if we put that, because if both the times are exactly same, only then the contact will be identical. There is nothing to think that the contact between different pairs of teeth will be different. All the teeth are identical. So therefore, if a red pair of teeth has a certain contact which is as shown in this diagram, the blue pair of teeth will have exactly the same contact at a later time, which is indicated as delta. So let us calculate these two times, once from the perspective of gear 1 and the other from the perspective, other time we will repeat this calculation from the perspective of gear 2. When we do that, we will get to see that the requirement is that the modules have to be the same. So let us see what the calculation shows us. So the theta 1, which is the angle between the blue tooth and the red tooth on gear 1, is 2 pi divided by n1. What is n1? n1 is the number of tooth in gear 1, okay, and 2 pi is the total angle in both gear 1 and gear 2, which means that the number, the angle between two subsequent tooth in gear 1 is 2 pi by n1. Similarly, the angle between two subsequent tooth in gear 2 is 2 pi by n2. Okay, so theta 1 and theta 2 are these two angles. Now, you want the time taken to cover theta 1 distance by gear 1 should be same as the time taken to cover theta 2 distance by gear 2. We understand the two gears are moving at different speeds. So therefore, the time taken by gear 1 to move by a distance of theta 1, by a rotational angle of theta 1, is theta 1 divided by omega 1, and theta 1 is 2 pi by n1, right. Similarly, the time taken by gear 2 to move by an angle of theta 2 is theta 2 by omega 2, but theta 2 again is 2 pi by n2. As we reasoned out that these two time durations must be exactly same, such that the blue tooth has exactly occupied the same position as the red tooth, both for gear 1 as well as for gear 2. Okay. So if that is so, then the requirement is n1 times omega 1 has got to be n2 times omega 2. So in other words, the number of tooth and the angular velocity of the gear has got to be inversely proportional. Also, what we have seen is that the radius of the size of the gear and the angular velocity are also inversely proportional. So if we now combine these two results, what we are getting is that we are getting a direct proportionality between the radius of the gear and the number of tooth of the gear. So therefore, radius by number of tooth has to be a clear constant, which essentially means diameter has to be a constant, and that requires us to show, I mean that actually proves the fact that the module of the mating gears are just the same. So the module of the mating gears being the same is a well known result, but I have, in my experience, I have found that students or practicing engineers don't quite have a clear logic as to logical reasoning as to why this requirement is needed. But the requirement is arising strictly from geometrical considerations. Mechanisms, you must understand, has a major major connection with geometry. So this connection is a geometric connection, that the module has to be same. Okay. So next we just touch upon what we know as higher pair mechanisms. And as I made a remark that higher pair mechanisms are a special class of mechanisms wherein there is line contact between, or line contact or point contact between the links. So we are seeing the front view of two links or two rigid bodies, so as to say one shown in red and one shown in blue. We have not shown the thickness, which you will be able to see in the side view. So in the front view, between the red object and the blue object, we are seeing there is only a point contact. So therefore, between the red body in 3 dimension, that is including its thickness, and the blue body in 3 dimension, there is line contact. So higher pair mechanisms have this qualification that they are either a line contact mechanism or a point contact mechanism, whereas lower pair mechanisms like let us say the revolute joint or a prismatic joint are a surface contact mechanism. When your when your piston moves within the cylinder walls, the piston has a surface area which is in contact with the cylinder walls. So therefore, that prismatic pair between the piston and the cylinder walls is basically a lower pair mechanism, whereas this one is a higher pair mechanism because it has line contact. If you have two spherical bodies, they will be in point contact, but they will also form a higher pair mechanisms. But in this talk, we are going to talk about two planar bodies, I mean two bodies which are in contact with a line contact. So what we have shown is the frontal view of it, wherein there is only a point contact, which means effectively in the 3 dimension, which cannot be shown in front view, but can be shown in isometric view or front view and side view taken together, it is a line contact. So the same thing is basically happening in gears also. If you realize in the front view of the gears, the contact, if we assume that there is contact between just one pair of teeth at an instant, even if you say there are two pair of teeth, nothing really changes. But to keep things simple, let us say that there is one pair of teeth in contact. So here too the contact, how should I draw it? So this is the point of contact between the two gears. Again, this is the front view of it. If I have what I am seeing as a point contact in the front view is actually a line contact, if I take into account that this gear has a certain width which is drawn perpendicular to the plane of the paper. So therefore, it is a line contact which happens between two meshing gear tooth, and that is why our gears are higher pair mechanisms. So it will serve us well to actually recapitulate ideas of higher pair mechanisms. So you may recollect that a higher pair mechanism has 2 degrees of freedom, and what are those? They are relative translation and relative rotation. So if I hold this blue object fixed, the red body can either translate without rotating over the surface of the blue body. Similarly, the red body can roll without slipping at about this point, like a wheel which is rolling without slipping. Let us say this is a small wheel which rotates over a larger wheel like a cycloid. So in that case, you will have relative rotation, you will not have translation. So these are the extreme cases. You can also have a combination of both of these. But it does happen that for both these motions, the instantaneous centers is along the normal to the point of contact. So in the case that there is complete sliding and no rotation, the body is actually moving along a circular path which is exactly conforming to the profile of this blue body. So therefore, the instantaneous center lies exactly at the center of curvature of this blue body. Please make please note this, that in case the red body is sliding in the manner shown. So if there is a case of pure sliding, the instantaneous center will be on the center of curvature of this path of sliding. The path of sliding is this circular profile. The center of curvature of that will lie somewhere here. So this is the instantaneous center if it is only sliding. If it is only rotating without sliding, that is rolling without slipping, then the point of contact is at instantaneous rest. So therefore, that is also the instantaneous center. So in either of these two motions, you get to see that the instantaneous center is actually lying on this common normal, because both the point of contact as well as the center of curvature lies on the common normal. So even if there is a combination of these two kinds of motion, you can expect that the instantaneous center will still lie along the common normal, and that is a very important aspect, that the instantaneous center between higher pairs of mechanisms lie on the common normal. And as I said, gear tooth will form a mesh. The gear tooth engagement is in the form of a higher pair. So in probably the next class, what we will do is, using this idea of higher pair mechanism, we will be able to derive what is known as the fundamental law of gearing. The fundamental law of gearing is that which will tell us that straight tooth gears are not possible. It is only involute gearing, involute gearing rather is the way to go forward, because it is going to satisfy this fundamental law of gearing, and rather arbitrary tooth profiles will not be able to satisfy. So that is where we will pick up the thread when we meet for the next session, but at this point I would like to throw myself open for interactions. I would really like to get questions from you regarding that is the topic that is covered. Usually we will stay focused with the topic that I have discussed as in the introduction, that we will talk only about spark gears, and I would like it if your questions are also on the topics that is associated with the lecture material. But even otherwise, if you have any related questions, feel free to post it to me right now. We can also have some interactions, video interactions if you want. And in any case, if you have further doubts even after the class gets over today, please feel free to use the course website, and there is a forum there, either with the help of your teacher at the host institute, or if you have access yourself, please post your questions so that I can clarify them for you through the forum. With that, I will end the lecture here, but I would like to have interactions in the remaining time that is available today. So please feel free to have interactions at this point. Okay, CTOR is asking the same question as I think I have answered this in MUJPR, that how can an increased normal reaction cause the increased torque. The torque as we derived is mu times n times r. So keeping the radius fixed, if the normal reaction is increased, the torque will be increased. So please look back at the notes. By the way, the video is also going to be archived, so please look back at the video, and hopefully that should clarify your question. Okay, APIIT HR is asking which type of gear should be used for what kind of application. I thought in my slide I told that if it is, if you are required to transmit motion between two parallel shafts, you have no other option but to use spar gear and helical gear. But between spar gear and helical gear, what is it that you want to use? Obviously helical gears are better in terms of noise and vibration performance. It is having more manufacturing cost, because cost is more for helical gears. So accordingly you will have to make a compromise. If your question is about whether your shaft itself should be parallel or whether you should take a skewed shaft, then that question has to be answered from an even more fundamental perspective, that depends upon your mechanism. So if and mechanism design would require you to sort of understand what are your space limits. Usually in most of these transmission boxes, the limitation is from the space side. You should not go for a very bulky transmission. Bulky transmission not only is a big headache in terms of space, but bulky transmission also means larger mass, which reduces your transmission efficiency. So in the question of what type of gears has to be used in what applications is actually very diverse question. I mean there is no clear answer as I understand at this point, but the question is I would like to answer it in this fashion, that if you are dealing with arrangements of parallel shafts, the answer is spur gears and helical gears anyway. If you don't know whether you should have parallel shafts or intersecting shafts, then the answer lies one step backwards. You should actually think about your mechanism and how much space it will take, how much torque it will consume and things like that. But I would think for the beginners it is better to understand that for a good deal of applications, let's say your automotive application, in these applications we are interested to transmit motion between parallel shafts, and if we are able to transmit motion between parallel shafts, we are able to get different torque and different speed requirements met, and therefore that is the arrangement which is preferred. So that is where spark gear wins. But again, for the same automobile, if you are interested to get two output speeds from the same input, then you must have a differential gear, but that differential gear arrangement cannot be attained by just using two parallel shafts. There you have to use intersecting shafts, not just intersecting shafts, you have to get into the concept of planetary gear train. So thereby you need a bevel gear. So I think that should sort of at least give you a good example to think about. Okay, I take that as answered. Which type of gear is supposed to be used? JNTU is asking the same question, which type of gear is supposed to be used. As I said just now, I think your question should be clarified. By changing the entire shape and size of spur gear by tradition, one torque in increase or decrease. See, shape does not matter. I mean, mostly we are saying that we are dealing with circular gears. Very rarely you will see non-circular gears, though it is not, it is there, but it is not widely used, simply because the manufacturing is extremely difficult and manufacturing makes it very costly. There are mechanisms which works on the operations of non-circular gears, but if you leave those very specific and sophisticated mechanisms aside, we are dealing with circular spur gear. So shape is not a question in question. We cannot change the shape of a gear, it has got to be circular. Regarding the size, as you asked, changing the size of the gear, obviously we can change the torque that is going out of the output gear, because if you look back, that was the starting point of our discussion, that depending upon the gear ratio, which is also the size ratio, you get whatever torque and whatever speed you want, right. So if you want a higher torque, you have to have a higher size ratio. So you have to put a smaller gear on the engine side and a larger gear on the output side, and depending upon this ratio, your torque can be magnified or demagnified. So that is the controlling factor, that depending upon the size, you can change the requirements, or you can play with the torque requirements that is there. Okay, KNMU is asking about pressure angle. Be patient, we will talk about pressure angle in the next class, not today. What is gear and how is gear manufactured? I thought I told you gear is a circular disc with straight tooth. The objective of constructing a gear is to ensure motion and power transmission between two parallel shafts. How it is manufactured is a question in manufacturing, it is not a question in design, but there are rack cutters available, there is gear hobbing, gear generation, different gear milling, different manufacturing processes are available. This course is not about manufacturing of gears, this course is about kinematics of gears. Let's keep it that way, but at the same time I will in my next class illustrate that how involute gear, though it appears difficult in terms of geometry, is actually easy to manufacture. So as we will see that involute gear requires a rack, in the rack cutting operation it requires a straight tooth rack cutter, which is the easiest thing to happen, and therefore gear manufacturing is made easier. In case you are interested, please look at YouTube videos. I have given one reference of a channel called Kinematics with MicroStation. This channel is available for free in the YouTube. There are lots of interesting videos about mechanisms. He has about 3-4 videos about gears. I think maybe 5 odd videos. One of them is about gear manufacturing. So that would be nice if you can go through that, and that should clarify you. Okay, the next question is from RBIT. What will happen if gears are not having backlash, and what is the standard value of backlash? Standard value of backlash is again a matter of standardization. Standard tables are available, one of which I have posted in my slides. They are available to you in the course pack. Depending upon different standards, the values obviously will have some deviations. And what will happen if they don't have backlash? That's also a difficult question. I mean, that's also something that I have made a remark. If you don't have backlash, then the mating tooth, between the mating tooth and the space available, the space width, as I said, the space width is the gap that is available between the two tooth, wherein the mating tooth has to come in. if there is absolutely no gap between the tooth thickness and the space width, then as you can expect, then it will be a very difficult fit. It is just going to fit, and the engagement is not going to be smooth. So to enable the engagement to be smooth, you have to keep a clearance, so as to say, between the gap that is available between the two consecutive tooth and the tooth thickness from the mating gear side, so that it is able to exactly come and fit into this gap nicely and smoothly without much effort. If you don't keep that gap, then sometimes you will be cluttering the mechanism and gearing action will not be smooth. So that is the reason why backlash has to be there. Which instantaneous center will lie along, why the instantaneous center will lie along the common normal is the question asked by CTOR. You must understand, in higher pair mechanism there is either relative sliding or relative translation. So as I showed in my drawing, in my schematic drawing, in the higher pair mechanism, the possible motions, it's a 2 degree of freedom mechanism. So the two possible motions is that of relative sliding or that of relative rotation. So in relative sliding, this red body just slides on a circular path, which is the geometry of the blue body, right. So there, that essentially means that the if a body is sliding on a circular path, that essentially means that the instantaneous center is I'll make myself a little more clear probably for you. So if one body is sliding over another circular body, then this is and this body, let's say, is fixed, then this motion is equivalent to considering this body to be rotating about its center of curvature. So this is the radius r. So this is the radius r. So this is going to have identical motion because the body is moving in this fashion. Now even if the other fixed body is not circle, but let's say of arbitrary profile, for the infinitesimal changes, because instantaneous center is about an infinitesimal motion. For the infinitesimal motion, we can consider the part of this body to be circular. So again, in this period of motion, the instantaneous center is here, whereas in this period of motion where the body has gone here, the instantaneous center is here. So again, the instantaneous center of a body which is sliding not on a straight path but on a curved path will be on the center of curvature of that curved path. That is like, a stone which is rotating round and round. The instantaneous center is obviously at the center of the curve which it is traversing. So that is why during the translatory motion, this is the instantaneous center. This center of curvature obviously lies on the common normal that is joining these two circles. So therefore, we will have for translatory relative sliding this to be true, that the instantaneous center lies on the common normal. Things are much simpler when you consider this to be a case of pure rolling or rolling without slipping or sliding. In that case, the instantaneous center is the point of contact. That point of contact again lies on the common normal. So in either case, whether it is sliding or with its purely rolling, then in both of these cases what we observe, that the instantaneous center lies on the common normal. So therefore, even if there is a combination motion where there is both sliding as well as pure rolling that is happening, even in that case the instantaneous centers will lie on the common normal. So that is the logic which proves that instantaneous center is the common normal. Okay, I'll take that as answered. Gears used in toys are they well designed? Well, these gears are usually made of plastic, and I think sometimes they are sloppily designed in the sense that they fail. But I really don't understand your question, and at least the importance of your question. Why is that important for you? If you are looking at the reliability of gears, this is probably important because, well, plastic gears will not have much life. That is the aspect. But as far as machine tools are considered, we are not worried about plastic gears. But maybe since these toys are cheap, you can have larger manufacturing tolerances, which means that it's not made with in a very precise manner, which is why sometimes you allow it to fail. But there are costly toys, and I hope that they are made with good precision. Anyway, if you want a serious clarification, let's have an interaction, hand raise, and we'll answer that for you. In precision machines, is backlash advantageous? No, precision machines backlash should not be there, especially if your machine is supposed to have a reversible drive. If your precision machine is supposed to move only in one direction, then there is no issue of backlash. But if you have a precision control machine where you want to have precise control of your motion, then if you have backlash in that machine, and the machine is such, let's say like a robotic arm, the robotic arm is supposed to move both forward and backward, but then the forward motion happens but the backward motion doesn't happen because one of your gears, when they are reversing, it is not causing the motion of its output. So that is something which is detrimental to the performance and especially the control system performance of those robots. So in such cases it is definitely disadvantageous. I have also talked about the radar example where it can be a life and death problem. Scuffing is about wear and other issues regarding the contact and engagement of gear, but definitely this is not something that I will talk about. This is supposed to be a first level course on gears within actually the subject of mechanisms. I don't think scuffing forms a part of it. Let's not talk about it. Why pinion gear is usually used as a driving gear? As I said, in automotive application, by the way, pinion gear, for those who doesn't know this terminology, pinion is the smaller of the gear and the wheel is the larger of the gear. Okay. So as remarked by BEC, it is usually the pinion which will be the driver gear and the wheel which will be the driven gear or the output gear. So that essentially means that the output gear is larger than the input gear. That essentially means that the speed of the output will be lower than the speed of the input. But on the advantageous side, that means that the output torque that will be available is more than the input torque that will be supplied. The engine will supply lesser torque, but the output will be more than what the engine can supply. So this is the advantage, and as I said, for practical operations of automotive engines, we have seen that the torque which is actually supplied by the engine is much lesser than what is required in the driving conditions, even in smooth plain road. So you need to beef up that torque, you need to magnify that torque, and therefore we use a drivetrain wherein we use a gear ratio wherein the output gear is more in size than the input gear, so that we get the magnification of torque. So I take that as answered. On any gear ratio is determined by the distance from the center of the gear to what? JNTUA, your question is not clear. We can possibly have a interaction session, or please clarify your question so that I can understand it. Okay, DGI is asking what is the difference between base circle and dedendum circle. Base circle is the circle from which the involute is drawn. We have not covered that in the present course. It is something which is not even visible in your gears. It is an imaginary circle, but the dedendum circle, as we just said, it is just the circle which passes through the bottom of the gear tooth. Okay, but base circle is not even visible that way. Addendum, dedendum are fortunately at least partially visible. Addendum is the circle which passes through the outer periphery. Dedendum is the circle which passes through the bottommost point of the tooth, right? But base circle is the circle, is an imaginary circle which based on which your involute is drawn. We will see that in the next class. Okay, I will take that as answered. So if there are any interactions required, we can have that. Let me try understanding JTUA's questions once more. Gear ratio is determined at distances from the center of the gear. Well, I think what you are asking me is this: you would have two shafts at known distances apart, and you would want a gear ratio such that a certain torque amplification does take place. So that means you would like to have an R1 by R2 to be equals to N, and also you would like to have R1 plus R2 equals to D, which is this fixed shaft distance. And once you have these two, you can actually solve these two equations for R1 and R2, and that determines your gear radius. I think this is what you are asking for. This is something about gear train design. When we come to simple gear trains, we will do such calculations. But at present, we were not talking about gear trains. We were talking about meshing and engagement of gears. I hope this is what clarifies your doubt. Okay, I don't see any other questions in my tab. If there are any, please feel free to post them right now. If any of you want to have any interactions, let's have that if you are interested. The material, the handouts of these slides will be available in the course pack, so please use them. There may be some corrections also as we go along, so the revised materials also will be put out. The ones that you have seen just now will be there as it is in the course website together with these videos archived. So in case you found the lecture material difficult to digest at the pace that it was offered, you please go back and look at those videos and try to absorb this material. And by the way, the references for this course, what I have followed is largely Ghosh and Mallik's book, Ghosh and Mallik's books on theory of mechanism, and Professor Mallik's lectures on kinematics of mechanisms, which are also available in NPTEL video lectures. So these are the ones which have served me as reference materials in the preparation of this course and also the course which I take at IIT on mechanisms. So these are very useful things. The other two books are again very standard books, Norton and Shigley, but I like Ghosh and Mallik, but Norton is also a very standard book. Norton is probably a little bit easier to follow than Ghosh and Mallik. Ghosh and Mallik is a little more mathematical in its approach, but depending upon your taste, you can follow either of the book. And I strongly recommend that you please look at this website in YouTube, Kinematics with Microstation. This has been developed by one of our collaborators, Ujjwal Rane. He's an IIT Madras alumnus. So there are lots of interesting mechanisms. He has these in like 5-minute videos of different mechanisms, and among which I think he has about 5 on gears. Hopefully we should be able to run one of these videos maybe in the next class when we do the involute truth profile in greater details. Okay, with that, if there is no other questions, that's what I see. If there is no other questions posted, let's call it a day. We'll again meet in the next session. Thank you very much.